Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics. Simplified your companion in exploring legal concepts with ease.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we're diving deep into the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972,
Okay.
specifically how it tackles the legal landscape
All
of
right.
sanctuaries, national parks, tiger conservation, and animal welfare in India.
Great topic.
As law students, this is going to be essential knowledge for you
Absolutely.
because it pops up everywhere in the field.
You're absolutely right. This act is like the bedrock of so many legal areas. What's really interesting is how it goes beyond simply listing what species are protected. It sets up a whole system for managing these protected areas, controlling trade, fighting wildlife crime, and making sure the animals are treated ethically.
Ah.
It's a prime example of how law can be a powerful tool for conservation.
So let's break this down.
Yeah.
The Act starts by establishing some key authorities,
Okay.
like the Director of Wildlife Preservation and these national and state boards for wildlife.
Right.
What's the deal with those days?
Think of these authorities as the people who actually make the act work on the ground.
Okay.
The National Board, for example, is like a think tank with the Prime Minister at the helm,
Oh, wow.
advising on everything from picking which areas to protect to making sure tribal communities' needs are considered alongside conservation goals.
Wait, the Prime Minister is involved?
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal.
It is. And there's this fascinating detail in the act.
Okay.
Being a board member isn't considered an office of profit.
Interesting.
In simple terms, that means no one's joining the board just for a big paycheck.
Right.
Their motivation has to come from a genuine passion for protecting wildlife.
That's a really clever way to prevent conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the protected areas themselves.
Okay.
Sanctuaries and national parks.
All right.
I know the Act makes a distinction between them,
Yes.
but I've always been a bit fuzzy on the specifics.
The easiest way to remember the difference is this. Imagine sanctuaries as safe houses,
Oh.
where human activities are regulated to protect the wildlife living there.
Okay.
Things like fishing or collecting firewood might be allowed,
Right.
but only with strict rules and permits. National parks, on the other hand, are like fortresses,
Oh.
for the entire ecosystem kept almost entirely untouched.
Oh, wow.
Human activities are much more restricted, mainly focusing on scientific research
Interesting.
and low-impact tourism.
So sanctuaries are a bit more flexible,
Yeah,
while national parks are all about preserving the ecosystem as a whole.
exactly. But even setting up these protected areas isn't a simple task.
Right.
The Act lays out a really meticulous process, investigating existing land claims, offering fair compensation to anyone whose land or livelihood is affected,
Okay.
and even making sure there are alternative resources for communities
Wow.
who depend on the forest.
It's not just drawing lines on a map then.
No, it's not.
It's about navigating some really tricky legal issues.
Absolutely.
Land rights, balancing human needs with conservation goals.
Right.
And making sure things are fair for the communities involved.
You've got it. The Act recognizes that conservation can't succeed
Yeah.
if it ignores the people who live alongside these animals.
Makes sense.
It's about finding ways for everyone to coexist sustainably.
Speaking of coexistence,
Yeah.
let's talk about the king of the jungle, the tiger.
Okay.
The Act has a whole section dedicated to tiger conservation, right?
Absolutely. The Wildlife Protection Act was the driving force
Oh,
behind setting up the National Tiger Conservation Authority,
wow.
a body with the sole mission of protecting this magnificent creature.
I can see why they needed a special authority for that.
Right.
Tigers are such an iconic species,
Yeah,
and their survival is so crucial for the entire ecosystem.
they are. The Act mandates the creation of tiger conservation plans for every tiger reserve in the country. These plans are like blueprints for managing their habitat, developing corridors to connect fragmented forests,
Right.
and even considering agricultural and developmental interests in surrounding areas.
So it's not just about keeping tigers in a cage.
No,
It's about managing the whole landscape to ensure their survival.
exactly. Successful tiger conservation means juggling a lot of factors.
Yeah.
Ecological needs, the concerns of local communities, and even economic development.
Yeah.
The Act recognizes that it's a delicate balancing act.
This brings up another interesting question. What about zoos?
Okay.
I know they're not just for entertainment anymore.
Right?
Does the Act recognize their role in conservation too?
It does. Zoos play a vital role in breeding programs, especially for endangered species.
Okay.
They're also crucial for research and educating the public about wildlife.
Right.
But the act is very clear that animals in captivity have to be treated ethically.
So it's not just about throwing animals in a cage and calling it a day.
Not at all. The act requires all zoos to be registered with the Central Zoo Authority
Uh-huh.
and meets strict standards for enclosure size, animal care, veterinary services,
Okay.
and a lot more. It even prohibits things like teasing or feeding animals in zoos.
Emphasizing the importance of treating them with respect.
Wow. I never realized the act went into such detail about animal welfare,
Yeah.
even covering seemingly small things like teasing.
It does.
It really shows how comprehensive its approach to protecting wildlife is.
That's right. The Act recognizes that animal welfare isn't just about preventing cruelty.
Right.
It's about fostering respect for these creatures.
Yeah.
And understanding that their well-being is deeply connected to our own. Welcome back to LexTalks. In the last part, we really unpacked the framework of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972.
Yeah.
Now let's dive into some real-world examples to see how this act plays out in action.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how these legal concepts translate into actual cases.
Right.
What kind of challenges pop up when you try to apply the Act's provisions?
One of the most interesting aspects of the Act is its focus on establishing and managing these protected areas, sanctuaries, and national parks.
We talked about how it involves navigating tricky land rights issues and balancing the needs of local communities
Yeah.
with conservation goals.
Yeah.
But how does that actually work on the ground?
Right. We discussed how the Act requires investigating land claims,
Yeah.
offering compensation,
Mm-hmm.
and even ensuring alternative resources for those affected.
Right.
But I'd love to see a concrete example.
Let's say the state government identifies a lush forest area teeming with biodiversity,
Good.
a potential sanctuary for endangered species.
All right.
The first step is to issue a public notification declaring their intention to turn this area into a protected sanctuary.
So it starts with a public announcement, putting
Yeah.
everyone on notice.
Exactly. This triggers a really thorough investigation.
Okay.
The authorities have to figure out who has existing rights and claims to the land
Right.
within this proposed sanctuary.
Okay.
That might involve digging into land records,
Yeah.
conducting surveys, and even holding public hearings to gather information from local communities.
Sounds like a lot of legwork.
It is, and there's a good reason for that.
Oh.
The Act recognizes the rights of people who may have been using this land for generations,
Right.
for farming, grazing livestock, collecting forest produce, or even cultural and religious practices.
So the Act doesn't just bulldoze over existing rights in the name of conservation.
Not at all. It takes those existing rights very seriously.
Okay.
And once these rights and claims are identified,
Right.
the Act offers a few options.
Okay.
One is to simply exclude land with established rights from the sanctuary boundaries.
Okay.
This makes sure people's livelihoods and traditional practices aren't disrupted.
So there's some built-in flexibility.
Absolutely. Another option is for the government to acquire the land or rights.
Okay.
But this has to be done fairly and transparently with proper compensation for the landowners or rights holders.
Right.
And it's not just about the market value of the land. It also considers the loss of livelihood and any other impacts creating the sanctuary
All
might
right.
have on the community.
So it's about more than just a financial transaction. It's about ensuring a just transition for the people affected.
Precisely. And here's another interesting detail. The Act allows certain rights to continue within the sanctuary,
Oh, wow.
even after it's established,
Correct.
as long as those rights don't clash with the main goal of protecting wildlife.
So human activities and conservation can coexist as long as it's done sustainably.
Exactly. For example, the Chief Wildlife Warden,
Okay.
that's the top official responsible for managing wildlife in a state,
Okay.
might grant permits for people to collect firewood or graze their livestock within the sanctuary,
Right.
but only under very strict conditions and in designated areas to minimize the impact on the wildlife.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've talked about setting up these protected areas,
Right.
but what about regulating human activities within them?
Okay.
What are some of the specific things the Act prohibits?
Well, some are pretty obvious, like starting fires. The Act strictly forbids setting fire to a sanctuary
Right.
or even kindling a fire that could endanger the ecosystem. It's all about preventing forest fires that
Yeah.
could be devastating to the wildlife and their habitat.
Yeah. A carelessly tossed cigarette butt
Right.
or a campfire that wasn't put out properly could have
Right.
disastrous consequences.
Absolutely. And then there's the prohibition against entering a sanctuary with weapons.
Okay.
Unless you have written permission from the chief wildlife warden or an authorized officer.
Okay.
This is clearly aimed at preventing poaching
Right.
and ensuring the safety of the animals.
So no hunting trips in sanctuaries unless you have a valid permit for a legitimate purpose,
Right.
like scientific research or maybe population control.
Exactly. And even seemingly harmless activities like using certain substances are regulated.
Oh, interesting.
The act prohibits using chemicals, explosives, or any other substances that could harm or endanger wildlife within the sanctuary.
I imagine that covers things like pesticides, right?
It does. It also covers things like mining or industrial operations
Okay.
that could release pollutants into the ecosystem.
Okay.
The goal is to make these sanctuaries safe havens for wildlife,
Right.
free from human-induced threats.
It really shows how thorough the act is in its approach to protecting wildlife within these areas.
Right. It highlights the importance of understanding that when you enter a protected area,
Yeah.
you're stepping into a space where human actions have to be carefully considered and regulated to protect the entire ecosystem.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Act's provisions for fighting wildlife crime.
Okay.
We touched on the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau earlier,
Yeah.
but can you tell me more about their role?
The Wildlife Crime Control Bureau, or WCCB, is like the elite squad dedicated to tackling poaching and trafficking.
Okay.
Think of them as the wildlife world's version of detectives.
Right.
They operate on both national and international levels to break up criminal networks involved in the illegal wildlife trade.
So they're not just chasing poachers through the jungle.
Not at all. Their work often involves high-level investigations,
Oh.
intelligence gathering, and
Yeah.
collaboration with agencies around the world. They might be tracking shipments of illegal wildlife products,
Wow.
infiltrating smuggling rings, or working with foreign governments to extradite wildlife criminals.
Sounds like something straight out of a crime thriller.
It can be. The illegal wildlife trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
Wow.
And the criminals involved are often very sophisticated and well-connected.
But the Act gives the WCCB some serious tools to tackle this wraith.
Absolutely. For instance, WCCB officers,
Okay.
along with other authorized personnel like forest officers and police officers, have the power to enter and search premises, stop vehicles, and even make arrests without a warrant
Yeah.
if they have reasonable suspicion that a wildlife crime has occurred.
So they can act quickly if they suspect illegal activities going on.
Exactly. And the act allows them to seize any wildlife animal parts or equipment used in the crime. This could include things like poached animal parts,
Right.
traps,
Right.
weapons, vehicles, or even financial records connected to the illegal wildlife trade.
It makes sense. You need to dismantle the whole operation, not just catch the poachers red-handed.
Exactly. And the seized items can then be used as evidence in courts, strengthening the case against the perpetrators.
Now, I'm curious about the Act's provisions on international cooperation.
Okay.
We briefly mentioned CITES earlier,
Uh-huh.
but what other mechanisms does the Act use to address the fact that wildlife crime often crosses borders?
Well, the Act specifically states that the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau is responsible for implementing India's commitments under various international conventions and protocols
Right.
related to wildlife protection.
So it's not just about enforcing domestic laws.
Right.
It's about working within a global framework to combat wildlife crime.
Right. This international cooperation might involve things like sharing intelligence with agencies in other countries,
Okay.
participating in joint operations to dismantle trafficking networks, or providing mutual legal assistance for extradition and prosecution of criminals operating across borders.
It's a recognition that wildlife crime doesn't respect national boundaries.
Exactly.
Ah.
For instance, if there's a smuggling ring operating in Southeast Asia that's trafficking tiger parts to China,
Okay.
the WCCD might collaborate with agencies in those countries to track the criminals' movements, intercept the shipments, and gather evidence for prosecution.
That's a powerful example of how international cooperation is key for tackling wildlife crime.
It really is.
Yeah.
And by incorporating these international provisions,
Yeah.
the Wildlife Protection Act establishes India as a responsible player on the global stage,
Right.
working alongside other nations to address this shared challenge.
This raises an important question, especially for us as law students.
Okay.
What are the practical implications of these international conventions and protocols?
That's a great question. In essence, these international agreements create a framework for harmonizing national laws
Okay.
and making it easier for countries to work together. For example, if a species is listed under CITES Appendix,
Uh-huh.
that's the category offering the highest level of protection,
Okay.
then countries that are party to CITES are obligated to ban trade in that species
Right.
and take steps to prevent poaching and trafficking.
So these conventions actually have legal teeth. They're not just symbolic agreements.
Exactly. They have real-world consequences and can influence legal decisions and policymaking within countries.
This really highlights the growing importance of international environmental law,
Yeah,
something aspiring legal professionals should definitely be aware of.
absolutely. As globalization continues and environmental challenges become increasingly interconnected,
Oh, yeah.
international law is playing a bigger role in shaping how we address issues like wildlife crime and conservation.
So the Wildlife Protection Act provides a really interesting case study in how domestic and international law intersect.
It does. It's a reminder that effective conservation needs a multifaceted approach
Yeah.
involving strong domestic laws, but also collaboration and cooperation across borders.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this part.
We have.
We've explored the Act's provisions for establishing protected areas, regulating human activities within them, combating wildlife crime,
Yeah.
and cooperating with international bodies.
And we've seen how these legal concepts translate into real-world action
Yeah.
through the work of authorities like the National Tiger Conservation Authority and the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau.
One thing that really struck me is how the Act strives to balance the needs of wildlife with the rights of people,
Yes.
particularly those who rely on forest resources for their livelihoods.
That's a crucial point. The Wildlife Protection Act isn't just about protecting animals and plants in isolation.
Hey.
It's about recognizing how interconnected ecosystems and human communities are.
It's about finding ways for both to thrive sustainably in a shared environment.
Exactly. And that's perhaps the most valuable lesson aspiring legal professionals can learn from studying this landmark legislation.
Welcome back to LexTalks. In the previous parts, we really dug into the nuts and bolts of the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972. But for this final part,
Right.
I want to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yep.
How has this act actually changed the game for wildlife conservation in India?
The impact of this act is really remarkable. It's shifted the entire paradigm of wildlife protection in India.
Yeah.
Before 1972, the focus was mainly on controlling hunting and trade.
You're right.
There wasn't much emphasis on protecting habitats
Okay.
or understanding the ecological roles of wildlife.
So it was more about managing wildlife as a resource
Yeah,
rather than recognizing its inherent value and the need to conserve it.
exactly. The 1972 Act was a turning point.
So,
It acknowledged that protecting wildlife requires a much broader approach.
right.
It's not just about individual species, it's about their habitats, the ecological processes they're part of,
Right.
and the complex relationship between humans and nature.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
You can't protect tigers, for instance, without also protecting their forests, their prey,
Yeah.
and the entire ecosystem they depend on.
Precisely. And the Act's emphasis on establishing protected areas, especially national parks and sanctuaries,
Yes.
has been crucial for safeguarding some of India's most important biodiversity hotspots.
So has the act actually led to an increase in the populations of endangered species?
There have definitely been some success stories.
Yeah.
The tiger population, for example, has shown promising signs of recovery in recent years.
Right.
That's partly due to the work of the National Tiger Conservation Authority
Okay.
and the focused management of tiger reserves.
That's great to hear. But I imagine the act's impact hasn't been the same
Right.
across all species and regions.
You're right. Some species, even though they're legally protected,
Uh-huh.
still face serious threats from habitat loss, poaching, and conflicts with humans.
So it's an ongoing battle with both wins and losses along the way.
It is. And it highlights the fact that laws, while important, are just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
Effective conservation needs a multi-pronged approach.
Okay.
We need scientific research,
Uh-huh.
community engagement education,
Yeah.
and we need to address bigger issues like poverty and development pressures
Right.
that often drive wildlife exploitation.
It's a complex problem with a lot of factors to consider.
Definitely. And even with all its amendments and updates,
Yeah.
the Wildlife Protection Act still faces challenges.
Okay.
One of the most persistent is the illegal wildlife trade.
Right.
It's fueled by demand for exotic pets,
Uh-huh.
traditional medicines,
Right.
and luxury goods made from endangered species.
We talked about the Wildlife Crime Control Bureau.
Yeah.
It sounds like they have a really tough job ahead of them.
They do. The illegal wildlife trade is a global network,
Right.
and stopping it requires strong enforcement within India,
Right.
but also close collaboration with other countries to disrupt these trafficking routes
Right.
and address the root causes of the demand.
It's a reminder that conservation often goes beyond national borders.
Absolutely. Another challenge is the ongoing issue of conflict between humans and wildlife,
Right.
especially in areas where human settlements overlap with wildlife habitats.
Yeah.
As human populations grow and expand into natural areas,
Right.
encounters between people and wild animals become more common.
Makes sense.
This often leads to conflict and sometimes even loss of life.
That must be a particularly difficult issue to deal with.
It is.
You have to balance the needs of both people and wildlife,
Right.
often in situations where resources are already scarce.
It's a delicate balancing act. Finding solutions means understanding the root causes of the conflict,
Ah.
developing strategies to reduce it,
Okay.
and promoting ways for humans and wildlife to coexist.
Okay.
This might involve things like creating buffer zones around protected areas,
Yeah.
helping communities find alternative livelihoods that don't rely on forest resources,
Right. Yeah.
or setting up early warning systems to alert people about the presence of potentially dangerous animals.
Yeah. So it requires a multifaceted approach, combining conservation measures with community development initiatives.
Exactly. And another critical challenge is the need to keep the act relevant and up to date in the face of new threats,
Yeah.
such as climate change and the spread of invasive species.
Right.
These emerging challenges demand innovative legal and policy responses to protect India's biodiversity
Yeah.
in a rapidly changing world.
So it's not enough to simply have a law in place.
Right.
It needs to be a living document, adaptable to new realities and evolving scientific understanding.
Absolutely. The Wildlife Protection Act has come a long way since 1972,
Right.
but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Oh.
Continued amendments,
Uh-huh.
strong enforcement,
Right.
and a commitment to incorporating the latest scientific knowledge and community perspectives
Yeah.
are essential to ensure it remains effective in safeguarding India's incredible natural heritage.
It's clear that the Wildlife Protection Act plays a vital role in shaping conservation efforts in India. But I'm also curious about its impact on you personally.
Okay.
As an expert in environmental law,
Yeah.
how has this act influenced your work
Yeah.
and your understanding of the field?
The Wildlife Protection Act has been a constant presence throughout my career.
Okay.
It's a cornerstone of environmental law,
Right.
and it's fascinating to see how its principles have influenced the development of new legislation and policies,
Okay.
not just in India, but around the world.
Oh, wow.
What I find particularly interesting is how this act goes beyond
Yeah.
simply listing protected species or setting penalties.
Uh,
It creates a legal framework that recognizes the intrinsic value of biodiversity,
okay.
the interconnectedness of ecosystems,
Yeah.
and the importance of finding ways for humans and wildlife to coexist harmoniously.
It sounds like the act has not only shaped legal practices,
Yeah.
but also fostered a deeper appreciation for the importance of conservation.
It really has. Studying this act reminds me that law is not just a set of rules, but a powerful instrument for positive change.
Yeah.
It can be a force for protecting our planet
Right.
and ensuring a future where both people and wildlife can flourish.
That's a powerful message and a perfect way to wrap up our deep dive into the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972.
It's been a pleasure exploring this landmark legislation with you and our listeners.
Thanks for tuning in to LexTalks. Stay connected and subscribe.